Rebel.
Engaged in perhaps the most important debate in American history. The issue is how to deal best with the all-out Soviet military buildup that's backed the Russian repression in Poland and their brutal aggression in Afghanistan. Of course, the Soviet nuclear arsenal still threatens the United States and indeed the peace of the world. Someone said that the search for peace is a moral obligation incumbent on every one of us. That's true. It's also true that the most important of all moral obligations is to think clearly. This kind of debate gives us the chance to do that. An open public exchange of ideas like this is only possible in a democracy. It's really essential to the democratic process. Given the facts and the time to think about them, American citizens can make the right choice. That's the purpose of this program, to give you the facts. It was produced with the full cooperation of the Department of Defense to help ensure that. One of the leaders you'll hear interviewed is the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. I think this documentary is one of the most significant I've ever seen on the subject. I hope it'll inspire you as a citizen to get involved. I'll be back.
Demonstrations like this have been held all over the free world, never in the communist world. This is the Nuclear Freeze campaign. Most of the people participating believe a nuclear freeze would bring peace and stability. But others believe that a nuclear freeze would do exactly the opposite.
Well, I think it's apparent why the Soviets are for a nuclear freeze. It would leave them in a position of permanent superiority, and that would be a very dangerous thing for America and her allies, because it would mean that the credibility of our deterrent, our ability to prevent war, would be seriously weakened.
Dad?
Who's right? This debate is really a countdown for America. For at stake are the peace and freedom of the free world.
Back in 1962, President Kennedy was able to force the Russians to back down when they had tried to establish missile bases in Cuba. The reason he was able to do that is because the United States enjoyed at that time an enormous military superiority.
The Soviets were forced to remove their missiles from Cuba, but they vowed never to be caught in such a position again.
Since that time, in a very unrelenting way, the Soviet Union has built its own strategic capability to the point that now it is superior to that of the United States of America.
With only half the gross national product of the United States, the Soviets have far outspent Americans on military hardware for many years, both in nuclear and conventional weapons. Such a rapid and intense armament program has not occurred since Hitler's arming of Germany before World War II. The Soviets are spending 3 times more than the United States for strategic nuclear weapon systems. The United States moved in the other direction and began to cut back during the 1960s.
We think it's in our interest and theirs to limit the deployment of defensive weapons, and we're quite prepared to discuss possible limitations in the deployment of offensive strategic nuclear weapons as well.
Because Secretary McNamara felt that the Soviets would not enter into an arms limitation agreement until they caught up to the United States, he began to dismantle some weapons systems and in fact freeze others, establishing a pattern of unilateral disarmament and U.S. restraint which continued for 2 decades. All 1,500 of our American B-47 strategic bombers were phased out beginning in 1961. All 70 of our supersonic B-58 strategic bombers were deactivated in 1970. President Carter accelerated our unilateral disarmament. In 1977, he canceled the B-1 bomber. At the same time, the Soviets were building and deploying their new supersonic strategic bomber, the Backfire, at the rate of 1 every 12 days. And they were already testing an even newer long-range strategic bomber, the Blackjack. Although the Reagan administration has funded the B-1 bomber, the first will not be deployed until 1986. The Soviet Union's medium and heavy strategic bomber force now numbers 835, while the comparable U.S. bomber force has been reduced to 376. In 1967, a freeze was placed on the number of U.S. land-based intercontinental missiles, and it remains in effect today. But the Soviets continued to build ICBMs, even though they passed U.S. numerical levels about 1969. President Carter further accelerated our disarmament by closing down our only ICBM production line. At the same time, the Soviets were producing or testing 4 new ICBMs.
A former Secretary of Defense, Mr. Harold Brown, once made a statement to the effect that when we arm, the Soviets arm. When we don't arm, the Soviets arm. The Soviets have not responded to restraint on the part of the United States of America. We have been restrained at a time when we had nuclear superiority. We leveled off at a number of about 1,054 intercontinental ballistic missiles that the Soviets have continued to build.
While U.S. silos are not designed for cold launch and refire, about 1/3 of Soviet ICBM silos are. Intelligence estimates credit the Soviets with about 1,000 extra missiles for reload and refire, making their advantage in ICBMs at least 2-to-1. These scale models of the latest deployed Soviet and American ICBMs show the relative size of missiles on both sides. Because of the larger size of the Soviet missiles, they have a 6-to-1 advantage over the United States in ICBM megatonnage. The Soviets also deploy mobile intermediate range and intercontinental range ballistic missiles. These mobile missiles can be concealed from our satellites, so we don't know how many they have. The United States has no mobile ICBMs or IRBMs. In 1967, a freeze was also placed on the number of U.S. submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which have since been cut back even further to 520. The Soviet advantage in all types of ballistic missile submarines is now 87 to our 32, or 2.5 to 1. While the Soviets have designed and launched 4 new classes of ballistic missile submarines during the last decade, the U.S. has built 1. The first U.S. Trident has just completed its sea trials, and the system is planned for deployment at the rate of 1 per year. During the past decade, the United States Navy was cut almost in half, from 950 to 450 ships. The Soviets have vastly built up and modernized their Navy. In attack submarines, the Soviet advantage is 220 to 84. When all types of active combat ships, large and small, are counted, the Soviets' numerical advantage is almost 3 to 1. Although many people believe that there can be no defense against strategic offensive nuclear weapons, strategic defensive weapons are, in fact, a central part of a nation's military strength. The United States followed McNamara's theory of no defense, called mutual assured destruction, which resulted in nearly complete dismantling of all our defensive forces. The theory is that if the populations of two nations are undefended, the people of each nation become hostages against nuclear war, because if one side strikes first, the other can retaliate against its civilian population. So you are playing a very important role in U.S. strategy, that of nuclear hostage. One major problem with this mutual assured destruction, no defense theory, is that it's not mutual. The Soviets are defending themselves, both with strategic defensive weapons and civil defense.
Our estimates are that the Soviets have been spending in the vicinity of $2 billion a year on civil defense. They have a large standing military civil defense force.
Their program provides shelters for military and civilian leaders and protection for a large percentage of their industrial labor force. New housing construction includes underground shelters. The United States has a civil defense program in name alone. The Soviet Union has built a massive strategic air defense system, backed by 100 times as many radars as we have. The Soviets built 2,500 fighter interceptors, while the U.S. cut back to 310. Their supersonic fighters can overtake our aging B-52s from behind. The Soviets deployed 10,000 surface-to-air missile launchers to shoot down aircraft, while the U.S. cut back to 0. The Soviets deploy anti-satellite weapons capable of destroying American satellites vital to our national security over the Soviet Union. The Soviets are also developing particle beam and laser weapons to destroy our missiles in space.
The decade of so-called détente witnessed the most massive Soviet buildup of military power in history. They increased their defense spending by 40%, while American defense actually declined in the same real terms. While we exercised unilateral restraint, they forged ahead and today possess nuclear and conventional forces far in excess of an adequate deterrent capability.
In just 20 years, the United States and the Soviet Union have reversed their military power relationships. The Soviets now have nearly a 2-to-1 advantage over the United States in numbers of strategic nuclear delivery vehicles. A more than 40-to-1 advantage in defensive strategic weapons. A 2-to-1 advantage in major surface combat ships and submarines. And a more than 4-to-1 advantage in tanks and artillery.
They are beginning to believe that they have the ability to put in a strike and then absorb whatever retaliatory capability we might have and keep on going until we were totally and completely defeated and exhausted and dominated. That is a very dangerous tendency. They write about it quite openly in much of their literature. And it has led to a certain controversy over here because the Soviets, in planning for this, refer to it as a protracted nuclear war.
Because we have no defense against nuclear missiles, if an all-out nuclear war were ever started by the Soviets, the United States could suffer up to 60% casualties, whereas Soviet casualties could be less than 10%. Although it is not likely the Soviets will use their nuclear weapons to actually attack the United States, they do use their strategic superiority as the ultimate bargaining leverage. For example, they claim that the terms of both the SALT I and SALT II strategic arms limitation treaties were dictated by Soviet superiority. As early as 1972, the Soviets had gained a 3-2 numerical advantage over the United States in strategic missiles. This was locked in place by the SALT I Executive Agreement. The SALT I ABM Treaty placed restrictions on the deployment of anti-ballistic missiles, which locked the United States into the no-defense policy, thus keeping you unprotected against nuclear missiles. In 1979, a broader agreement was signed by President Carter. The SALT II Treaty appears to have equal limits, but it is deceptive in several ways. For example, the United States is required to count as strategic weapons 258 B-52s retired to the aircraft boneyard in Arizona, even though it would take more than a year to get them flying again. Yet the 250 new Soviet backfire bombers are not counted as strategic systems on the Soviet side, even though they can strike the United States with nuclear bombs. The SALT II Treaty was never ratified by the United States Senate because it would have locked us into inferiority in strategic weapons systems. Nevertheless, both the Carter and Reagan administrations have complied with its terms.
Once when I was monitoring the SALT II negotiations in Geneva, I had a discussion with Alexander Shukin, who was the scientific advisor to the Soviet delegation. I said to him, Dr. Shukin, we have unilaterally canceled the B-1. What will you do in return? His response to me was, Senator, I'm neither a philanthropist nor a pacifist. So that's the Soviet mentality. And in fact, without provocation, they have spent some $450 billion more on defense in the last 10 or 12 years than has the United States.
The record, I think, is quite clear. The Soviets have taken advantage of assault agreements in the past. They've simply used them to increase their capability while encouraging us or lulling us through a sense of well-being into a lessening of our conventional as well as our strategic capabilities.
Soviet propaganda and agitation to cause U.S. military cutbacks are an economical supplement to the Soviet Union's investments in new weapon systems, and were essential in gaining Soviet military superiority. While President Reagan opposes a nuclear freeze at current force levels, the Soviets actively support it through such Soviet-sponsored organizations as the World Peace Council.
The KGB, I believe, claims that this is one of their most successful enterprises, that is, this World Peace Council orchestrating the nuclear freeze movement. The World Peace Council itself is a front organization of the Soviet Union. They have affiliations in 135 countries of the world. The U.S. Peace Council in the United States has somewhere up to 40 other chapters in the United States. So here we have a direct communications, guidance, and direction link from the office of the Chief of the Information Directorate in the Central Committee of the Soviet Union right down to City Hall. The guidance is there, the funding is there, and the direction is there. You can imagine the difficulty of organizing a mass rally that is held in New York. Advertising has to go out, the mailing has to go out, the reservations that have to be made. We would probably conservatively say that it would cost them $300 million to put on a year's activity in the United States. This is apart from their salaries and their travel expenses. The platform they present is appetizing to many absolutely honest, decent Americans, to many churches. Peace, of course, we are all for. We've been praying for peace since the day we were born.
Most of the people participating in these demonstrations are unaware of Soviet involvement in manipulating the peace movement. Although most U.S. organizations sponsoring the freeze are non-communist, they have long worked for sharp cuts in U.S. defenses. They claim that we are equal to the Soviet Union, because hardly any American would favor freezing the United States into military inferiority. And they don't mention that the United States has in fact tried a freeze since 1967, and that in 15 years it hasn't worked.
They are hard bargainers. Whatever you say about the Soviets, they do not throw in the towel on negotiations, nor do they swap plans, U.S. plans for deployed Soviet systems. And that is the position a freeze would place us in. We would, in effect, be saying to them, you keep your deployed systems, and we will freeze our plans to correct that imbalance.
Some things you can verify, but the SS-16, for instance, it is a mobile missile, which is contrary to SALT II agreement. We know that they have built them, and we know that they are either stored or deployed. We don't know which. And what it boils down to is you can't trust them.
A nuclear freeze, rather than reduce the likelihood of nuclear war, would increase dramatically the risk of a nuclear war.
Thus, the nuclear freeze may accomplish just the opposite of its stated purpose.
This president is very fond of saying, very accurately, that there's only been one nation racing, and that's been the Soviet Union. We feel that it is a very dangerous thing when they are adding this degree of strength and adding it as rapidly and as consistently as they are. So we think it's vital that we maintain and modernize our deterrent, and that way we hope we can get the very best result out of the arms reduction talks, and that is really the only road to peace. If we aren't strong, we will, as the president says, tempt tyrants.
To a lot of people, the nuclear freeze looks like a tool for peace. I don't think it is. I think it's a monkey wrench in the works. All it would freeze would be the military advantage the Soviets have now. Would also derail our government's efforts to negotiate not a freeze on nuclear arms, but a reduction. It would send the wrong kind of message to the Soviets. A message of a loss of will and commitment to peace on our part. It couldn't be verified, and it wouldn't be honored. It would encourage the kind of aggression we've seen with the Soviets since they broke a treaty to invade Poland with the Germans in 1939. Since they broke another one to invade Afghanistan 3 years ago, and another one to use poison gas there last year. I think the massive campaign for the freeze has been succeeding mostly because there's been no comparable effort from the other side, our side. If you agree, I hope you'll talk to your friends about it. The strongest antifreeze of all, the facts.
For almost 40 years, we have succeeded in deterring war. Our method has been to organize our defensive capabilities, both nuclear and conventional, so that an aggressor could have no hope of military victory. We must continue to improve our defenses if we're to preserve peace and freedom.
A nuclear freeze would leave us no options. It would lock us into military inferiority. It would cancel the B-1, the MX, the Trident, and the cruise missile. It would undermine our bargaining position and prevent any reasonable arms reduction agreement. More important, Americans would be prevented from reversing the no-defense mutual assured destruction policy. You would remain hostage against nuclear war, unprotected from Soviet missiles. When he came to this country in 1979, Pope John Paul II saluted Americans and their determination to preserve freedom. On Peace Day, January 1st, 1982, he wrote that the peace promoted by totalitarian regimes is a false peace, that Christians not only have a right, but a duty to protect their existence and freedom. NBC reported that in August 1980, the Pope sent an envoy to the Kremlin with a handwritten ultimatum in Russian for Brezhnev. Although he was head of a universal church, he was still a Pole. And if the Soviet Union moved against Poland, he himself would lay down the crown of St. Peter to stand shoulder to shoulder with his people.
The United States has fought 4 wars in my lifetime. In each, we struggled to defend freedom and democracy. We were never the aggressors. America's strength and, yes, her military power have been a force for peace, not conquest, for democracy, not despotism, for freedom, not tyranny.
So the stakes are high, and although time is short for America, you can make a positive choice. While the media have focused on the nuclear freeze resolution to the point of advocacy, the resolution for peace through strength has gained major support without any press attention. It has been endorsed by 10 state governors and passed by 13 state legislatures. It has been sponsored by a majority of both houses of Congress, 127 national organizations, and endorsed by President Reagan. Peace through strength is the alternative to the nuclear freeze. It is peace through strength which can guarantee peace and freedom. But what is being decided now is whose strength will shape our future, the Soviet Union's or the United States.
To support a nuclear freeze, you have to believe that the Soviets care about keeping the peace and keeping their word. The record shows they don't care about either. The record shows that, like the Nazis before them, they're engaged in an all-out military buildup aimed at the world. Ask yourself, if this were the summer of 1939, would you vote for a mutual weapons freeze with Adolf Hitler? Who was it who said, if you cannot remember history, you are doomed to repeat it? The Earth has been free of World War for 37 years because the United States and its allies have maintained an armed force strong enough to deter the only possible aggressor, the Soviet Union. A world of nuclear arms is surely a terribly dangerous place. But it seems to me we're safer to put the peace of the world in the hands of those we trust, not those we fear.
No country has ever been able to preserve peace or defend itself against a potential threat by being weak. We'd like for you to participate in the Peace Through Strength poll. As chairman of the Armed Services Committee, I would be very interested in knowing how you feel about this, so I hope that you will write Peace Poll at the address shown on the screen.
Please let Senator Tower know whether you favor peace through strength or a nuclear freeze. Write Peace Poll, Boston, Virginia, 22713.